Today we have a special guest, Alex. Alex is one of many things. So Alex is, you might know him from the Self-Hosted Podcast show. You might know him from as Ironic Badger on Twitter. Iron Badger. I kind of like that one.
Yeah.
Just making this up as I go.
It's strong.
That is right. Or you might know him from many other things. He just started his own YouTube channel. He's got a lot going on. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions on how he manages all of this. Anyways, Alex, I would love for you to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself for those who may or may not know you.
You and me both. I often wonder where I fit in sleep sometimes. But yeah. Self-Hosted Podcast is probably the most well-known thing that I've done lately. Do a bunch of other stuff. PerfectMediaServer.com. I mean, originally, Perfect Media Server was a series of blog posts I wrote over at linuxserver.io, which is a project I was involved with for some time, and not for a long time now, but when I left Linux server, I sort of decided that it would make sense for Perfect Media Server to have its own place to live that I could still maintain and update and that kind of stuff. So an MKDocs wiki was born. What else? Oh yeah, KTZ Systems, my new YouTube channel. That's you can relate. You know, you think, oh, I'll just start a YouTube channel. How hard can it be? It's just an 8-minute video, right?
Oh yeah. No, I know.
It's hard.
I've been there. My last video was about 8 minutes, and it took me, I put about 20 hours at least into just the editing and finishing. That was after things were filmed because it is so complicated.
And that's because you're not new anymore. Like when I got started, it would be 2 or 3 months ago now, you know, I had to figure out what camera to buy, what lights to buy, what microphones to buy, and I'm still figuring that out. I mean, I'm used to with the podcast, you know, I've got an RE20, hit my monitor, sat just here, just out of shot, you know. So I'm used to being static when I'm presenting. But with a video, like I don't want a massive turd of a microphone in front of me. Well, okay, just like you do.
No, I know what you mean.
Let's move on.
Awkward.
But yeah, there's a lot of content out there from other YouTubers about, you know, spending several $1,000s on microphones and lights and gear. I'm just like, no, I don't want to do that yet.
Yeah, it's tough. I went through that same thing too. I mean, in the beginning, you're just like, okay, how can I do it ultra cheap? I want to go the ultra cheap way. Obviously, you're into audio and video before that, but me, I wasn't. You know, so I was like, okay, I'm going to go to the cheapest way possible. Let's figure this out. And then you kind of keep upgrading and figuring it out, and it's like it's like chasing the dragon. It's like you think there's this perfect setup that will do everything you want, and I'm still figuring it out. I mean, this mic works really well for live streams. Doesn't work great for YouTube. That's why I don't use it there, because I don't want, like you said, the big mic in front of my face. I have a mic up here, and it's still, you know, I'm 3 years into YouTube, and every now and then I get crazy echoes, and it's kind of the worst. But
you got a few more subscribers than I do.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's taken a while. But speaking of subscribers, I mean, like you came out swinging. I mean, you came out. Your videos were awesome. You're touching on the right topics. Your editing is great. Of course, your voice is great, or you wouldn't be on a podcast. And your topics. Some
say I have a face for radio.
No, now you have a face for YouTube. A face for YouTube. Yeah. No, not at all. And so yeah, I was thoroughly impressed. Like the bar is set. After I saw your first couple of videos, I was like, oh my gosh, like the bar is set so high now to get started. Yeah.
It puts you off making another one. Do you relate? Like you think, well, my last one was this good. You know, in my mind, it was this good. I like the 10 gig networking video I did got like a stupid number of, like I did not expect to get more than like a few thousand, and it's got like 30-something thousand views, which is ridiculous to me.
It is. I mean, I don't think
I don't even have any RGB. I mean, look at you.
That's right. I think I could spare some. I think I could spare some. But yeah, it's like I'm thoroughly impressed with your channel, and I love your content. And speaking of, like, I think, you know, the Tailscale one you did on Magic DNS, super awesome as well. And yeah, I'm just like, I'm so impressed. Because if I look back at my stuff, you know, as me, I didn't know how to be an entertainer. I didn't even know how to talk. I didn't, you know how to look in the camera or how to edit. And, you know,
So weird though.
Yeah, it is weird.
Like, I'm in a room by myself and I'm going to talk to this tiny little circular thing over there. And
yeah.
oh wait, there's actually people on the other side of that too. Like,
it is weird. It is so weird. I still haven't figured it out. I mean, this on people know that come to my channel, like, this is kind of the normal me, a little bit more amped up, but this is the normal me. YouTube, not the normal me, because I'm either, you know, winging it or you know, reading from a teleprompter and trying to act like people are watching. So it's tough. That's tough. Yeah, so I think you mentioned a couple of things. Oh, Linux Server IO. I wanted to touch on that a little bit because I know, like, I've read you were involved, and like I've been a huge fan of Linux Server IO for a long time. I think I owe my first 20 videos to Linux Server.io because that's kind of how I got started. I got started on YouTube basically doing virtualization stuff, but my end goal was containers, and I had to kind of like bring people along. No one knew that. I knew that, but I had to like, okay, this is virtualization, but I think there's a better way to do most of the things you do, and that's with containers. And like 90% of my videos in year one were like Linux Server IO containers. So, I mean, tell me a little bit more about that, because I don't know the history. I know you were involved, but it's like serendipity, because like then you had me on your show, and I was like, I think that's around the time when I realized, oh, you were really involved with Linux Server IO.
Well, I don't know how in depth you want to get. So if I ramble on too much, do tell me to shut the F up.
Never.
Back in 2014, 15 or so, I was doing a computer science master's, and I was working for Apple at the time on the Genius Bar. And I got really into Linux because of PCI pass-through. I think Wendell did a video on running GTA 5 on Arch Linux. A year or so later. So, this was proper cutting edge stuff, and you had to, back then, compile kernels, and I had no idea what on earth I was doing. You had to buy a very specific motherboard, a very specific CPU in order to get VTD to work for the PCI pass-through stuff to work properly. This is when I think it was a 34 or 3570 i5 CPU. Also, I was on a part-time retail salary, and my wife was doing teacher training, so we weren't exactly flush with cash back then. And so the idea of throwing £100 into buying a CPU just to do pass-through was like, I've got to really think about this. I've got to be careful. But anyway, that's a different story. I was getting involved into Linux is the point of mentioning that stuff. Around the time I was doing my computer science master's and leaving Apple. During that year at uni, I had a lot of free time whilst I was supposed to be writing a dissertation. Obviously, nerd in a computer science class surrounded by lots of other nerds, I was finding out lots of cool, interesting stuff. And one of those things was this hot new technology. I mean, we used to run on Unraid at the time. We used to run VMs, and I used to host these repos for Arch Linux VMs with things like SAB-NZBD and Plex and a bunch of other stuff. So I used to compile packages, basically AUR style, for these VMs and host them for Unraid users to run as VMs on top of Unraid, kind of like plugins plus almost. Then Docker came along, and I was working with Tom. This was before they hired John P. I worked briefly with Tom, who's the founder of Unraid, on adding support for Docker, saying, hey, this is something that's really cool. We should look at adding this. And whilst we were looking at adding Docker, we were also looking at how to run the Unraid engine on other Linux distros. So we were doing all sorts of crazy stuff. Me and a couple of buddies on IRC back then, cross-compiling Unraid kernels with Ubuntu kernels and Zen kernels. And it was just, honestly, it was nuts to think we were going to run anything close to a reliable server that way. Was just insane. But my budget meant that, I wanted to have one computer which ran my server and was also my desktop and was also potentially a media server. a media playback client. So I could have 2 or 3 GPUs in one system, pass them through to different VMs, and have one running XBMC. It was still called XBMC back then.
Oh yeah, Xbox Media Center. Yeah.
Yeah. One running a desktop, running probably Windows 10 for gaming, or Windows 7 probably. Yeah. So out of all of that malaise, I made a couple of good buddies on the Unraid forums, and we decided that nobody else was making standardized Docker containers back then. And certainly nobody was making them with anything approaching good documentation. I quite enjoy writing documentation. That makes me probably a bit strange, but I do.
I do too. So I'm strange with it.
My buddy Lonix, who is a Norwegian fellow, he was pretty good at developing containers, and he knew a lot more about Linux than I did. So he came up with the whole idea of the user ID and the group ID business. So like mapping permissions between the inside and the outside of the container. But there was a moment I remember where, over the years I'd blown away and reinstalled my server so many times. I got really good at setting up, the torrent clients and what have you. But there was a moment where I blew away my server. I just set it all up with containers for the first time, blew everything away, and then reinstalled the OS, brought up my containers again, and everything was exactly how I left it before I reinstalled. And I was like, mind blown moment. This is it. Docker is the way. This just makes so much sense. You separate the configuration from the runtime. Hallelujah. Here we go. So
yeah, for sure.
How that feeds into Linux server is I started documenting all of the stuff that I was doing at the time through blog.ktz.me. Then I bought the domain name linuxserver.io and just transferred that blog over to blog.linuxserver.io. That's literally all I did. I just changed the paint above the door. And then we started releasing a few containers, and then the project kind of grew and attracted a bunch of people. And then eventually we worked with Plex on containerizing the Plex container. So those that don't know, the official Plex container is actually a Linux server container with a different coat, different jacket on.
All right, because you guys had the best Plex container too. I mean, for all the reasons why Linux Server IO containers were awesome, because standard interface, standard mapping for users, standard config location for mapping your volumes. Yeah, that's awesome. So you guys built the first Plex one.
Yeah, there was like, there was just, it's weird to me that it was just me and a couple of dudes hanging out on IRC. And then it turned into a project. Let's just have a look. I know the numbers are always a little bit weird because of how Docker Hub counts downloads and stuff.
It's funny.
But if you look at the Linux server front page, it says 19 billion pulls now,
crazy.
Which is
crazy. And it's so funny you mentioned that stat because just last night I was updating some of my containers, and I noticed that they were going to LCR or something. They were going to a different domain, and I was like, well, let me see what that domain means. And it was like, wait, that domain doesn't exist. And then I read you guys' documentation saying that's the fronting way of doing it because of the changes with Docker when they put the anonymous changes in place and all of those constraints in place that you guys fronted it then with this domain. And then that's where I read about Docker pulls being a little bit optimistic, I'll say.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I haven't really been involved with Linux Server now for the past, 4 or 5 years. Yeah. Pretty much around the time I moved to the States, I started the Self-Hosted Podcast. And around that kind of time, I kind of lost interest, honestly. Had a bit of a lover's tiff with a couple of the guys in the team as well, sadly, and just ended up parting ways. So they still do a really good job, I think. There's a few things they could improve, I think, from the outside now as I look in. But there's plenty of good things they do, and I'm still on good terms with several of the other developers.
Awesome. Over there, so. I mean, such a wonderful project. So thank you for sharing that, because I like I said, I knew your name, and then I knew you were involved with it, but not to what extent. And I'm like, I don't want to DM Alex and ask him hey, tell me about your involvement with Linux servers. So I'm so glad you mentioned it. Because that's been on my mind for months. It's probably my biggest regret, actually, that I'm no longer involved with it, in tech still. I think about what that project could have been. And I always saw it when I was involved with it as a way to give back to the open source community that had given me so much, Over the years, I ended up working at Red Hat as a way for me to give back a little bit.
But I always wondered, like, if we tried to turn Linux server into a business of some description, like tried to turn it into like a container consultancy company, or even charge people a couple of dollars a month, dare I say subscriptions. I know that's a dirty word these days, but
monetize.
you know, yeah, I always wonder, like, would there have been a market for that? Would it have been a sustainable way for us to earn a living and like then turn it into like a Linux server OS? You know what I mean? Like a homelab OS almost.
I like where you're going. Yeah, no, I like where you're going. Yeah, so many ways you could go with that for sure. Yeah, like an app engine type, I don't know, cloud provider almost for all of your containers. You just supply some config or no config, except the defaults, and you got to go. And that's. Yeah, a lot of possibilities there, but still, I think everyone's. I don't know. At least people in my channel and in the Discord, they I'm sure they greatly appreciate all the work that everyone's done there, because it is awesome. It made my content easy in the beginning, but it also helped me teach Docker a little bit easier too, because I could, people could look at one container or two containers, or any containers they were using from Linux Server IO, and just copy pasta, as I always say. But yeah, so. So a couple other things. You mentioned YouTube and cars. I see your cars in the background too, and I know you like cars, and I know you go on trips with your cars, and I know you bought a second one.
I have those guys to thank for it.
Yeah,
the top gear guys.
Really? Yeah. So Golf. So I'm not a huge car person. I know they're Volkswagens. Are they Golfs?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Well, this one is a 2004 R32 Golf, and the one next to it is my sort of daily, but I don't really commute anywhere, so it kind of isn't. They're kind of both fun cars for me. I have a 2019 what's called Mark 7.5 Golf R. They're both really fun cars. They're both all-wheel drive. There's a lot of history involved with this one in particular. So it has we can't see the cars due to the crop apparently. So
I apologize.
Maybe I could just do that.
Look at this.
How's that?
I like it.
Can we see that now? So yeah, the cars, the Golf R32, the 2004 one, is the one that's really interesting. The Golf R is fun, don't get me wrong, but it's just a 4-cylinder turbo engine. Like, it's not super special. Like, it's fast. I'm actually doing a track day with it next weekend at Virginia International Raceway, so that should be a lot of fun. But the VR6 that's in the R32 is the interesting part, the engine. So it's a 6-cylinder engine. And do you remember the Bugatti Veyron? Like, Top Gear did a whole thing on it back when it came out in like 2004.
Is that a motorcycle? Bugatti? Wait, no.
That's a Ducati.
A Ducati. I see. I see.
Yeah, I think.
No, I don't. So I don't. I don't.
Well, the Bugatti Veyron was VW's project in the early noughties to say, right, we want to give a car 1,000 horsepower.
Wow.
And everyone's like, okay, sure. So they built an engine called the W16. And essentially, it's got 16 cylinders and like 12 radiators or something stupid. Like, it was a technical masterpiece. And even now, it's one of the most impressive cars ever made. But what they wanted to do with this car was make a balls-to-the-wall Golf. And so a typical Golf has like 4 cylinders, or a diesel engine is a pretty normal kind of eco box, right? But this one has a VR6 motor in it, as I keep saying, 6 cylinders. But what's interesting about them is how they're laid out. They're kind of laid out offset. So one intake is short, and then the exhaust is long. And then the next cylinder, it oscillates. So you've got short, long, short, long, short, long. And you end up with this really distinctive exhaust note, which sounds a bit like Chewbacca. And so people in the community have nicknamed these cars the Wookiees.
All right.
And so every April up in the North Carolina mountains, there's an event called Wookiees in the Woods. And my wife and I go up there, take the cars up there, and just surround ourselves with other VW enthusiasts. And
all right.
It's a good time.
Yeah, so you just did this. So I saw this on Twitter then. So I think I saw, because you were saying like, hey, I went on some trip. I didn't understand what the trip was, but you were taking your car, and I think did you take both of them, I think?
This picture is in the Georgia mountains, not far from the tail of the dragon. So
that's awesome. Yeah, what a nice trip. I love road trips. I love driving, and I know a little bit about cars, but I'm not a fanatic. I could fix them, oil change, you name it, but not a fanatic. But that is
more than
awesome.
most.
What's that?
That's more than most.
Oh yeah, yeah. When I was
Most
younger,
people just go to a Jiffy Lube.
yeah. Well, when I was younger, it was like I didn't really have a choice. I don't know. We just didn't have much, and so it was like if you want the oil change, you do it yourself. You go down to whatever Pep Boys AutoZone. You buy the 5 quarts of oil and you figure it out.
Yeah.
And the oil filter, because it was a lot cheaper. I'm sure it's a lot cheaper now too compared to how much they charge for service. But yeah, so awesome. Another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I think you were doing, this was a little while back, and this is how we reconnected too after I was on Self-Hosted, is that you were doing some more Terraform stuff. I think a while back you were doing Terraform with Proxmox, and then you were using the K3S Ansible playbook to then automate
your
K3S
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about that. So I think you 100% automated building a Kubernetes cluster from start to finish with K3S, Ansible, and then working backwards to Terraform and Proxmox?
Something like that. Yeah, I mean, it was a while ago now.
Yeah, it was a while.
The details are a little bit hazy.
Yeah, that's okay.
But I do remember how impressed I was. So you, as anybody that follows you know, is that you wrote a bunch of playbooks, Ansible playbooks, which deploy K3S on top of some virtual machines. And what I wanted to do was automate the deployment of those machines onto Proxmox, because if anybody's ever done this kind of thing, you will know that as you're deploying, Kubernetes, sometimes you think, well, I didn't quite do that quite as I wanted. Maybe I should just wipe the slate clean and nuke and pave. And Proxmox is really quite a straightforward interface, but clicking your way to victory it gets old pretty fast, right? And so what I wanted to do was write a bunch of code so I could do maybe 1 or 2 commands, certainly a cleanup command to automatically delete everything. But in order to do that, you have to have a create command with Terraform, or apply, to create all the resources with Proxmox. And there's a Terraform Proxmox plugin, which a couple of years ago was kind of awful. But now it's pretty much a first-class thing. It's Telmate/Proxmox.
Oh, yeah.
And this thing it's legitimately impressive. You can treat Proxmox now almost to the same level of programmaticalness as like a VMware or like an Amazon cloud almost. Not quite, but there are some rough edges. But for the basics, like create a VM, create a network, create a container, it's great.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, I haven't done Terraform with Proxmox yet. I need to at some point. I could have used it this morning because that's exactly what I was doing. Basically, I was creating nodes Kubernetes nodes to replace the existing nodes, and I should have automated the whole thing. But I'm like, okay, do I spend the time automating it or do I get it done? That big debate that we all have, especially in personal time. It's like, am I trying to get stuff done or am I trying to automating stuff? Or yeah, but anyways, so that's what I was doing. I was tearing down virtual machines, taking them out of the Kubernetes cluster, building a new one with my new Cloud Init images, rejoining them to the cluster. And so, yeah, I totally could have used that, and I should learn it a little bit more. I've used it for Cloudflare. That's how I deploy a lot of my DNS changes, and I think I'm going to start deploying it with a lot more things too, because it's.
Well, what's really nice is with this code, you can deploy the entire K3S stack in under 10 minutes from having no VMs at all. From the minute you press the enter key, 10 minutes. And it just clones. I mean, this is across a 2 or 3 node Proxmox cluster. It clones, like this little black box here is one of my Proxmox nodes. That one there is also, you can't really see, it's probably cropped in the stream, but that's a Proxmox node. I've got a couple in the basement as well. I've got, let me just grab it. I've got a bit of a thing going for these at the minute. Yeah. These little boxes, these little ProDesk boxes. This one's a 4th gen Intel, so I've kind of retired this one now because it draws too much energy. So at idle, this thing is like 20 watts, 15, 20 watts or so. Under load, it's about 40 or 50 watts. But if you just go from the 4th to even just the 6th gen, you half those numbers. I mean, the idle power draw on these things is impressive. And I was watching Jeff Geerling's video about Raspberry Pis this week with Eben Upton from the Pi Foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and talking about how the Pi Foundation prioritized industrial customers over
the
the hobbyists, the people that put them on the pedestal to begin with. And I just think,
yeah, I mean, I could relate. So I watched that whole interview too, and I think he followed up with saying like, hey, most of the industrial customers aren't the big IBMs. They aren't the big companies you think about. Most of their industrial companies, at least what he said.
like PyKVM maybe.
Yeah, or he was saying a lot, mom and pop shops, what he said, 4, 5, 6 employees, and he would have this, this kind of arrangement with them to ask them how many they wanted. They would say it, and he would say, well, how much do you really need? And then settle somewhere in between. But yeah, it was interesting. I watched that, and I think he had a lot of reservations, even like, making that choice, as anyone would. But it was tough. Tough call, I bet.
An unenviable choice, because the reality is, had they not made that choice, I suppose, the scalpers would have bought up all the stock from the channel anyway, and then we'd have been paying inflated prices anyway. So
that's right. Yeah.
I do absolutely empathize with the decision. However, the Raspberry Pi 4 is what, 4 or 5 years old now?
Yeah, it is.
It's just slow. I mean,
agree.
yes, for certain situations like PyKVM, where you need those hardware inputs for the power supply switching and stuff like that, right? There is nothing else really that is such a standard interface. Talk in terms of software development here. It's a standardized interface.
That's right.
But the thing about these boxes is they are routinely on eBay now, and we're talking 6th or 8th gen Intel CPUs for $100 to $150.
Yeah.
With 16 gigs of RAM and an NVMe slot and a SATA slot and, proper USB ports on the back and a real Ethernet port and display ports. And why would anybody buy a Raspberry Pi at this point? It's just a mystery to me.
Yeah. And I'll even go, and then you get, a desktop class processor with, possibly VTD, VTX, because you can do virtualization. I'm right there with you. Mine are a little bit more expensive than that. I have a cluster of Intel NUCs, but same idea. It's like I can get, I can get a lot of work done or workloads added to those machines, and even run a hypervisor if I want to. And not to mention, some of them have QuickSync for Intel, which is going to get your transcoding too. So it's like, oh man,
we didn't even mention QuickSync.
I know. So you get your transcoding on one of these boxes. So not only do you get the compute, the GPU piece, but the encoding and decoding with QuickSync. And QuickSync is pretty miraculous for what they've been able to do. It's like Intel's best kept secret, and no one uses it. I shouldn't say no one. A large majority of the people don't do it or don't use it. But yeah, it's incredible for what you can get now, and that's a lot of compute inside of $100 box. And with a Pi, you're gonna spend that. Once you start adding stuff up, dongles, cases, all of that stuff, you're over $100 out of the gate too. So.
Right. That is the thing, isn't it? Is a Raspberry Pi is still very much, I've got to build the rest of it. Yeah. I've got to supply my own power. I've got to supply my own keyboard and mouse. And, those $100 things I talked about on eBay, I've in the last couple of months, I've bought 3 or 4 of these things to replace various other systems. And I've now got 3 or 4 cheap plastic keyboards knocking around for who knows what eventuality, but they come with all these things. And yeah, I just find it interesting looking at the Pi Foundation and how they started and where they've ended up. And it's an interesting journey, but maybe they could have some kind of lottery that you could apply for, or so. I don't know how it would work.
Yeah, it was an interesting interview, though, because he said they were still producing, 800,000 or 1 million a month. Like, everyone thinks that, like, they weren't producing anything. No, they were producing just as much as they were before.
7 million.
Yeah, but they were
last
backlogged.
Year.
Yeah, they were so backlogged. Yeah, 7 million. I think they had, like, 4.5 mil on back order or something like that. So they're just working through their backlog. Oh, man, what a... But yeah, so going back to them being old. Yeah, they are. I mean, they've been out for a couple of years, more than a couple of years, and I wish to see them get an upgrade anytime soon. I know that they had talked about that on that interview, but I think they were saying too, for them it's still kind of like 2020 for them, because they've been playing catch up. And
what was interesting was Jeff specifically asked about PCIe support in the next generation. Obviously, he's running a 4090 and doing stupid stuff, for reasons. But, what I could see being a really valuable product that doesn't exist anywhere yet is, and this is touching on a conversation we had in Self-Hosted Podcast post show this week. I just pre-ordered a framework laptop. And what I want to see is some kind of an M.2 or a Thunderbolt kind of HBA card. So, these old framework motherboards or even a Raspberry Pi with an M.2 slot would be amazing, because then I could connect 4 or 5 spinning hard drives and then have, maybe a cache disk of an M.2 somewhere in there. And suddenly I've got a kick-ass server out of recycled cheap parts. And specifically with the framework stuff, I know we're digressing from the Pi slightly, but with the framework stuff, they include QuickSync on the CPU if you go the Intel route. And I have some data here from when I was looking at, I used to have a big dual Xeon box in my basement for everything. And at idle, that thing pulled like 140 watts. But when it was transcoding, it would easily pull like 300 watts from the wall, easily. But if you look at QuickSync, the same workload is 20 odd watts at idle, and it's 35 watts when it's doing a transcode. So it's a 10x reduction under load of energy consumption, which is less heat, it's less noise, etc. And so when I see the framework laptops include, in the Intel side, of course, include QuickSync, my mind goes to, okay, that's cool as a laptop right now, but in 2 or 3 years' time, when I want to upgrade that motherboard, I need a way to turn that into a server. And currently, Thunderbolt stuff's super expensive, but I would love to see some kind of a cheaper way to do that.
Yeah. So that's a good point. So I'm familiar with framework, and in my mind, I was just thinking, I can upgrade, I can replace, I have the right to fix anything in here. But that's a good point, is that like after you're done with it, if they made, I don't know, chassis to slip those motherboards in, and you could totally repurpose those devices. I mean, I don't know if that's a product or a feature they're going after, but that sounds like something that I'd be on board for. Because I mean, we all do it. I mean, we all collect stuff, we build stuff, and that stuff becomes you upgrade, and then you it's a big hand me down, and you shuffle all your parts around, and you say, this device used to do this task, and now I'm going to upgrade the old device that did that task, and it's just this big hand-me-down all the way down. But yeah. I mean,
framework do make a case. They've just actually, I think, partnered with Cooler Master to make a proper case for older motherboards and stuff that get, that would otherwise become e-waste. And, that's part of the sales pitch for framework, is you can upgrade everything about the laptop.
Yeah.
But the trouble is, right, if you want to turn it into a NAS specifically, you need a lot of SATA ports, or you need a lot of PCI ports for M.2 drives, or whatever it might be. So you need PCIe lanes, you need, a whole bunch of other stuff. Those motherboards already have it, but they're all through Thunderbolt controllers at the moment. And so, the chassis is kind of the easiest problem to solve here. For me, like, I know what I want. I just don't know how I would connect the peanut butter with the chocolate to make it go together and actually create a PCI switch or those kind of things. Maybe we should get Wendell on that.
No, yeah, I'm sure he has it on the back of a napkin somewhere. He's like,
probably.
I've already figured it out.
Yeah, you wake up at 5 a.m. and reshuffle Proxmox nodes. Wendell wakes up at 5 a.m. and just designs PCI switches.
That's right. Solving the world's problems as soon as he opens his eyes. Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, you're right. Thunderbolt, cool tech, but expensive interface and expensive to get anything connected to it. So yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to be going through some Thunderbolt woes here in a little bit too, doing some upgrades. So I can totally relate. Yeah, another thing, also, I just want to touch a little bit back on, if you don't mind, Terraform and Ansible, because you're very familiar.
We did digress a little.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to make sure, like I just wanted to make sure, because I will say I'm kind of a noob to both, right? I'm a hack at best at Ansible. I learned from people, I forked code, and I made things work, and that's kind of my life. I just make things work.
You've just described the life of a software developer there. That's literally...
That's my title too.
Yeah.
That's what I do for a living. So yeah. So I make things work, and that's what I did. That's what I do a lot with Ansible. And with Terraform, I didn't have a lot of experience with it, and that's exactly what I did when I started doing the Cloudflare stuff, when I was creating DNS entries and figuring it out. And I see a lot of comparisons and contrasting between the two technologies. And in my head, and I would love for you to correct me if I'm wrong, but in my head, I think, well, and this comes from Nana too, because she told me this on YouTube a long time ago, but not personally, but I was watching her channel. She was saying, use Ansible for, configuration, and use, Terraform for building up your infrastructure. And now I see like a lot of overlap now too, where it's kind of like, okay, where would you apply one where you wouldn't apply the other? Or why would you choose kind of one over the other? I know you're huge in Ansible, and you obviously know Terraform too. And this isn't an interview question. And if it is, just blink twice and I'll skip it.
No, so I spent a lot of the last few years working with OpenShift. And I did a huge project with VMware where we were trying to deploy OpenShift on top of VMware for one of my customers. Automatically using a mixture of Ansible and Terraform. And it's a really interesting problem to try and solve. And the short answer is you use Terraform to deploy the infrastructure. So create things like VPCs and security groups and firewall rules and the VMs themselves and any other infrastructure level configuration that you might want to do. So if it's not on a specific host itself, that's what I mean by infrastructure, right? So maybe you need to configure a specific port and a specific switch to be on a specific VLAN, for example. That might be something that Terraform would take care of. You probably could achieve the same thing in Ansible, but the reason it works very well in Terraform is because it has a state file. So it is stateful, and it knows, certainly based on the last time you ran Terraform anyway, what the current state of the infrastructure looks like. Whereas with Ansible, it's much more designed to be a configuration management tool. So what I mean by that is it will go and idempotently apply the configuration that you have to a specific instance and say, let's say you want a list of packages installed, for example. You want these 10 packages installed on a specific host. It has no concept until you run it whether those packages exist on that host or not. So what it will do at the beginning of each run is Ansible will go and gather a bunch of facts. Then it will compare that list of packages it gathered in its fact gathering against the list of packages that you define to say, is there a discrepancy? Do I need to make a change here? And that, it works fine on the host level, but it's not super efficient when you're querying remote APIs through cloud providers and a bunch of other stuff. There's a bunch of other reasons, but essentially the two tools are best suited to their own niches, although they can both reach outside their niches. Doesn't mean they should. It's kind of like, you could use winter tires in the summer on your car, but there are going to be some compromises, right? You're going to have to, a really good example as well is that Terraform is designed from the ground up to be a lot more of a programmer's kind of way of thinking. So, for example, variables get interpolated at runtime. So let's say you've got you want to deploy a Kubernetes cluster. Who do that, right? You say, right, I want 3 worker nodes. And then for each worker node, I want certain variables to be different. But for the majority of them, I want them to be the same. Terraform's for each function is like a way of looking up specific information from an array or a table of some description or some kind of hash or map. And you can look up specific values based on key value pairings within remote data structures and apply them to that specific instance. And so when Terraform's looping through that for each kind of count operation, the context of that object is compartmentalized, right?
Yeah. So you have objects, right? So you have these objects that, have all their properties and you can iterate through them. Yeah.
So if you're used to object-oriented programming, you are probably fairly good already with a lot of the core Terraform concepts of how it treats different machines, right? And different, different instances or different instantiations of things. I hope I explained that well.
Yeah, no.
For anybody that isn't, deep into it.
No, that was great for me because that's something that so I didn't observe that because I had very specialized tasks for each thing that I needed to do. But one thing that kind of threw me off was like, just Terraform state in general. And it's now like, I can dump the state from the remote stuff. So in Cloudflare, I say, hey, go analyze Cloudflare, dump my state. But now I own the state for that device, and it doesn't know until the next time it checks. And that's where I can see drift happening. And so I was like, is this the right tool? And then I contrast Ansible to that. It's just going to try to do everything to everything that you have in your list or, in your collection. And so I'm like, I do like the Terraform way. So if you're going to solve the same problem with both solutions, I like Terraform because it will only do what it needs to do minimally, I think, if you have state already. And then Ansible is just going to, in contrast, try to do everything to everything. I know it's going to organize collect facts and stuff like that. But, even in my own playbook, sometimes I'm like, hey, on step one, you knew this machine was offline. Like, why are you trying all of this stuff on step 5 or stuff?
Yeah, that can be a bit annoying.
It's like, but you knew way back there it was offline. In contrast, in Terraform, it would have known right away. It would have just said, nope, you're offline. You're excluded from whatever you're trying to do. But yeah, it's interesting.
The other thing is Ansible is based around Python and YAML. Yep. And you can very quickly end up in a situation where you're trying to turn YAML into a programming language. It's not. And it really never should be. And a great example of this is my automated DNS configuration that I did a few months ago. Wrote a blog post on it. And I was trying to just do a simple thing of comparing 2 lists to check for duplicates. Super simple operation, right, logically. But when you start trying to do that using Ginger filters, which is what Ansible uses under the hood, Ginger 2, it just can't. So you pipe the list into the filter to say, pipe duplicates or whatever, and it removes all the duplicates. It doesn't tell you which things were duplicated. So then you start trying to compare a list with 2 lists that have got duplicate items, and it just loses its mind. And so then you end up. I ended up. A guy on the Selfhosted Podcast Discord ended up writing me a custom Ansible filter, which was like 15 or 20 lines of Python in the end, to do what I was trying to do in like 100 lines of YAML and still failing. So they have limitations, both of them, and just accept them.
Yeah, YAML. I've written so much YAML because Docker and Kubernetes and other things, but yeah, it's interesting to think about because I'm a web developer. I do all kinds of development, but mostly web type stuff. And so I think of YAML kind of like JSON, but and so I can think of a JSON object. It kind of helped me with YAML, except for how it's white space sensitive. But yeah, I couldn't imagine trying to parse or trying to treat YAML
tabs versus spaces.
Yeah, that's around. Oh, me? Ooh,
yeah.
Oh, I might be a weird one because I'm kind of like. It depends on the day, or it depends on the language, I would say. I don't know. It's faster.
That's such a cop-out answer.
But it is really, it depends on, okay, if it's my own code, I'm going to hit tab. If it's my own code, I'm going to hit tab. Just because, why hit something twice? Why hit the space
or 4
bar
times.
That's right. That is true. But I do I do tab, 2 space, but yeah, and then I use editor config to make sure that my tabs and spaces are only two spaces.
That's just it, right? Yeah. I typically use spaces, but only because over the years I've switched editors so many times and they all do it slightly differently. I'm like, right, okay, well, the constant here is the space is always going to remain 1 character. It's always only ever going to be 1 space, whereas a tab can be
2 or 4,
whatever it likes.
So the thing I was just talking about, if you don't know this, it's this thing called editor config. It's a tiny .config file that you can declaratively tell your editor how to be configured, and it works on almost every editor you want. You use JetBrains, use code.
you SSH into a random server
yeah.
at 2 a.m. in an outage on some customer's remote site, and they don't have that thing, and then yeah.
That's true. That is true.
Default is king.
That's true. That's a good point. I didn't think of
Yeah.
terminal. I was thinking of software developer. Like I have my ID and I have my tools. I wasn't thinking of remoting in and editing files.
It's those standardized interfaces again. You know, the space bar is always doing the same thing, whereas the tab is kind of a law unto itself.
That's true. I never thought of it that way. Yeah, that is true. I still hit tab. I don't know. It's just easier for me to do it. It's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like I said, then if we're writing software, we put a config on everything, and it's like hit whatever you want. It should work, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. So a couple of other things that like I wanted to touch on too is like so you mentioned YouTube, you mentioned you like cars. Obviously, you have a job, you work full time, you do the self-hosted podcast. I'm sure you have other hobbies that you're not talking about, or that I see on Twitter. Like how do you manage all of this? Like, do you use any kind of time management, or is you seem like you got it all together? And I think a couple of people have asked too in our Discord, like. And they posed the question to me, and they know how I manage it poorly. But I wanted to talk to you and see, like, if there's anything I can learn or do, or is there anything you do that makes this manageable?
I have a very supportive wife. That probably helps a lot.
Certainly does.
No, I guess a few years ago I used to live in London, and I was spending an hour commuting each way every day. So that's an hour or two gone from the day every day. I used to go to bed at random times and wake up super tired and all the rest of it. And we made some lifestyle changes. I moved to America and work remote now. I'm living, as Elon Musk would say, I'm laptop class, and I'm living in La La Land.
Yeah.
But it means I've got an hour or two back every day that I would have spent commuting, and I can spend that time either just going for a walk and just thinking about what I'm going to do that day, or sometimes just getting a bit of extra sleep. That means the time I am actually sat at my desk, I'm hyper focused. And pretty much, I've just said it there. Like I hyper focus on stuff for an hour or two, and I try and get a lot done. And if I don't achieve what I wanted to achieve in that hour or two, I'll just be like, yeah, screw this, I'm done. And then I'll go and play drums for 20 minutes or guitar for a bit, and I'll just sort of do something completely else and reset my mind. And I think my observation about working in an office environment for the preceding several years before COVID was there's a lot of people that spend a lot of time expanding tasks to fill the available time. But if I'm working remotely, I have all the time in the world to do what I want to do, so long as the day job gets taken care of. And as long as everybody at day job is happy, then everything else is a bonus, right? And so typically what I'll do is I'll spend an hour or two, doing day job, and then I'll spend half an hour going and, futzing around in the garage doing some woodworking or something stupid, or playing drums for a bit, like I said. But then I'll come back and I'll do another hour or two at my desk, and I just rinse and repeat. So I'm never really doing the same thing for more than an hour or two at a time. And it means that when I'm doing those things, I'm the best version. This sounds so cheesy, but
I like it.
I'm the best version of myself whilst I'm doing those things that I can possibly be. I'm not like fatigued. I'm not totally bored of it. And I appreciate that's a very privileged position to be in. But I think it's sort of borderline ADHD behavior. Like I will get bored of stuff kind of quickly and move on to the next thing. But, I've made decisions in my life that enable that to happen. So if you're in a similar position and could do the same thing, I'd highly recommend remote working. It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, I am for sure. Like, I worked at a small startup. We got acquired by a bigger startup, and they're full remote. So I've been doing the same thing. So a lot of similarities. I like that you say hyper-focus, because that's something I do too. A lot of people talk about, not being able to concentrate or working on too many things. I have the opposite problem, where I will work on something until it's done. And if it's not done the way I like it, I will keep doing it until it's done the way I like it. And so I have the exact opposite people. A lot of people say I have ADHD. I'm working on too many things, and I do work on a lot of stuff, but then I hyper focus on things. And sometimes that's good, and it's definitely good for work. But sometimes it's not so good for personal stuff, because I'm like, how is it like midnight already?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. The Factorio effect. Yes, we all know that one very well.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I just find it really interesting that I've never been diagnosed with any kind of condition or anything, but it took me most of my 20s to realize that's how I operate. I used to get really down on myself, actually, that I would do something for a few weeks, like a hobby. I'd pick a hobby up for a month or two and then kind of get bored of it and drop it and then move on to the next thing. And, over time, those hobbies rotations have got longer. 3 or 4 months, I'm interested in cars and everything I think about is cars. And then it's drums and then it's woodworking. And then it just kind of oscillates between these different things. But there's some constants that are in there. Linux has been in there pretty much constantly for the last decade plus. Computers in general for my entire life, But my hyper focus on working on like the K3S stuff, that was a hyper focus where I was focused on Linux as well as day job. It was also my hobby for that month, and I think it's important to capture that inertia. And try and find a way to, I write blog posts and now do YouTube videos as well. When I'm in that kind of mode, like just get it done, just get the stuff out the door, write it. If it's not perfect, it's better than nothing, right? Yeah. And then you can build, and you'd have to relearn it next time either. So like we mentioned, I'm big into documentation. I love documenting things. Like I'm big into Obsidian at the minute. Like all the brake stuff I've been doing, the prep for the track day, I've been doing on my own brake work, upgraded brake pads and rotors and stuff. Been writing down the torque specs and what size socket I need for that specific bolt, so that next time I come to do that job in 6 months and I've completely forgotten, I don't have to spelunk through the manuals to go and find it all. It's like it's there in one note, dun 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 dun. Yeah. Write documentation for yourself to make your future self's lives easier, and that's probably the lesson of my 20s is write yourself good documentation for future self.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, same. A lot of the same themes. I've had hobbies and I've rotated, and for me, for a while, it was like rotating between video games and doing home lab stuff. And so this was before even YouTube stuff. And so I'd, rotate home lab, video games, home lab, video games. I get sick of tinkering on computers. I'd play a game, and then, that all changed when I started on YouTube, because now it's like, it seems like I don't play games anymore, but that might be changing here in a little bit with some changes coming up. But I agree with you too on documentation. I've always been a fan of writing documentation, even going back to like my tech support days. One, to remind myself how to do it the next time I need to do it. But two, to help others too. And I love sharing like good notes, like engineering notes. I even started at work. Everyone was taking notes individually, and I'm like, why do we have I was saying to myself and kind of out loud too, like, why do we have 4 ways and 4 people's ways to solve these things? Or, I had this problem, you had that problem 3 months ago, but I didn't know you had that problem. And so now we have shared engineering notes, and it's so great, because it's just like, where's the one place to look to get things done? And when you start collaborating on notes, that's when it's really cool, especially with people who do similar stuff as you, or even in your home life,
There was a book I read a few years ago now called The Phoenix Project. Have you read the Phoenix Project? I haven't
read it, but I've heard so much about it.
Highly recommended read. And it talks about this kind of hero worship developer. Like they kind of fall into this role without meaning to, where all roads lead to this one person who has all of this tribal knowledge in their head of how to do XYZ on company's platform. And, they're so busy keeping the lights on because over the last 20 years, they developed all of this kind of basically an internal wiki in their head. And they haven't got the time to get it out on paper. And much like you, I'm a huge advocate of trying to do that. And that was my role in Linux server in the early days. Was the standard documentation format they still use today was me. I came up with that, and it was because I thought, well, what would I want as a new guy? Right, I need to know this, that, and the other, and it should be the same across all the containers, because then it's just easier to consume when it's a standard thing. So.
Yeah, I know that about tribal knowledge too, especially like working for, a startup or even larger companies I've worked at. You have the one person who knows everything, but and not to any fault of theirs, but they just haven't documented any of it. And so I've even said this over the last 2 weeks. Like I don't I don't like working for organizations when you ask how to do something, they say, go ask so-and-so. It's like,
Yeah.
I want self-help. Like, where's the self-help at? Like, let's build wikis, let's build notes, let's put stuff, somewhere in a KB where I can get to it and not have to bother you to ask who to ask to get things done. And so
this is the way.
yeah, I agree. I'm right there with you. All right. Kindred spirits on documentation. All right. I write a lot of it. I think it's fun. For me, it's kind of for my audience, but for a long time, I've been writing it for myself. And I've learned that, like, well, if I can figure out how to do this in 6 months' time, maybe people reading it can figure it out the first time. So
Right.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised if you put analytics on just even a simple blog post. You'd be surprised how many people read it.
I agree.
And I've got this very simple blog post on mine that is how to convert a QCOW2 image to VMware, I think, or the other way around, maybe. KVM to VMware, and it gets tens of thousands of views a month.
All right.
And it's just like, this took me 3 minutes to figure out, but I wrote it down into a simple to digest format, and looks like nobody else has. So I get the clicks.
I'm coming for you. No, it's not like I'm running ads or anything. But yeah, I have I've been running some variation of some kind of blog for, years. I think going back to maybe 2008 or something, somewhere.
Wow.
And yeah, that's how I got involved in self-hosting. I was like, well, I want to run my own website, and I had this janky old computer that I got on the internet with dynamic DNS, and I wrote my own HTML and CSS and put a logo up there, and it was terrible, but it was like my gateway into self-hosting. But yeah, I have some weird posts that get so many hits on my other blog. Like, I don't even remember. It's like ones I wouldn't even think of. Like, one was like, for the longest time, how do you shut down Windows 8? That was like it was like killing it in my stats. And I'm like, really? Like, this was like, I had one little, section with a header that's like, here's how you shut down Windows 8, because no one understood the Windows 8 interface. They're like, what the heck do I do? What do I press? And that blog was like killing it for like years until, obviously Windows 8 went away. But
that's so funny.
Yeah. Well, hey, Alex, I know I want to be mindful of your time and everyone else's. Dude, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
This has been a long saga, mostly on my part. No one here knows it, but we've been going back and forth trying to find a time slot for a long time. A
little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So he can't even remember the blog post he did, and which sparked this conversation where he said, "Let's get on Twitch," and I said, "Let's do it." But anyways, I'm so glad and so thankful you were able to take some time out, and thank you so much for sharing everything that you've been doing, not only today on the show, but just across open source, across YouTube, across everywhere. I think a lot of people have learned a lot of things from you. And people obviously enjoy your show.
To you as well. You fill a similar hole in the internet as well, especially with this 100 days of homelab thing. So I think that's when we started talking about this. Episode 73 of Self-Hosted, which was June 2022. It's taken us almost a year to make this happen, but I'm very glad that we did.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.